On this episode of A Voice from the Hills podcast, we welcome Dr. Daniel Crosby. Dr. Dan is Chief Behavioral Officer at Orion Advisor Solutions, and he's one of the leading behavioral finance experts in our industry. His published works include The Behavioral Investor, Laws of Wealth, Personal Benchmark, and aptly titled and courageously titled, You're Not That Great, as well as a separate title that we'll talk about, but it's a bonus. You got to listen to the pod to hear it. We're going to talk about the importance of education, environment, and encouragement as we all try to overcome the financial limitations that our own behavior can provide us. And I think you're going to find it an excellent conversation and one worthy of spending some time listening to. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Dr. Daniel Crosby.
James Warner is the founding partner of Silicon Hills Wealth Management. All opinions expressed by James, his co-host, and guest are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Silicon Hills Wealth Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of Silicon Hills Wealth Management may maintain positions in securities discussed in this podcast.
Hey, good afternoon, Dr. Crosby, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, James.
Yeah, I thought we'd start with sharing with our audience how you kind of chose a career in behavioral science. Did it choose you, or did you choose that career?
Yeah, a little of both. So I am the son of a financial advisor. So I went to my freshman year of college thinking that I would probably be on that track as well. So I entered as, sort of a business major, as much as you enter as anything at 18 years old. And but I took a lot of psychology courses for my general ed classes, and I just absolutely fell in love with them. And I found myself just sort of orienting to that really hard. And then when I was 19, I served a 2-year mission for my church. And so, after 2 years of living on the other side of the world, I lived in the Philippines for 2 years. After living for 2 years on the other side of the world, observing a different culture, trying to help people get their lives on track, I was sort of more invested than ever in a field in the human sciences. And I think the combination of those two things really, really sealed it for me. So that initial love paired with the real world experience of living in a different culture and trying to help people, I think are what tipped it for me.
Wow. So you actually married your passion with your original grooming, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah. So, just to kind of fast forward a bit, I graduated when I was 23 and I started my PhD program 3 days later. And so by the time I was 25 or 26, I was, about halfway done with my PhD and doing a lot of counseling, and I just didn't like it anymore. I didn't like I was bringing work home with me. It was like, 40 or 50 hours a week of talking to people who were in really acute distress. And I just had poor boundaries and sort of empathy fatigue. Right. And so I came to my dad and I said, look, I love psychology. I love thinking deeply about why people do the things that they do, but I don't think I can do it in a medical setting. And he said, well, there's a ton of psychology in my business. And I was like, what are you talking about? This wasn't, I had always sort of thought of my dad as a numbers guy and sort of like one part stock picker, one part sales guy. And, I was like, what are you talking about? Psychology in your business? And so to make a long story short, that was sort of the conversation that set me on the path that would eventually take me to your podcast today.
Wow. Well, that's really cool. That's a good story. So I thought we'd start with, one of your earlier works, and it's courageously titled. I love the title. It's titled, You're Not That Great. And within the book, you talk about living life is ultimately about realizing that, the less that you need to be special, the more special you can become. I love that quote. And I was hoping you could unpack that a little bit for the audience.
Yeah, I'm happy to unpack it a bit. And the book is actually was written on the strength of a TEDx talk I did. So I was asked to give a TEDx talk I was probably like 29 years old or something. And I got asked to give this TEDx talk about psychology. And I was like, okay, what am I going to talk about? And I started thinking about sort of like, this I believe. I'm like, what are the things that I believe fervently? And all of them sort of had this core of, it's only by embracing our own mediocrity that we're ever really kind of truly special. So the talk and the book are about this thing. So there's this vast body of research about things like self-esteem. So I grew up in this generation where everyone gets a trophy and everyone gets a gold star kind of thing. And the research around self-esteem says that stuff doesn't work. Like, the way for you to feel good about yourself is, surprise, surprise, to do hard things, take risks, get your teeth kicked in sometimes, but then to come out the other side and, work hard and build something great. You think about things like being a great investor. Being a great investor takes owning that you're as susceptible to bias and emotion and self-deception as the next person. There was a lot of research around ethics and morals. And if you want to be sort of a person of character, we found that people who think of themselves as special or different or unique will do anything to keep that crown of specialness, even if it requires whatever, lying, cheating, stealing, to sort of maintain that. And there's also great research that shows that people who think they're special just don't work as hard. The minute life gets tough, they go, wait a minute, like I'm God's chosen son. Like, why isn't this going my way? Like, I give up, And so there's just a ton of research to show that embracing your own fallibility and quirkiness and weirdness and mediocrity is actually the way to have a really great life.
And you talk about it in one of your books, and I'm kind of a fan, so I've read all but one of them, and I found out about that one while I was researching you. So I got to get a hold of that one. But you talked about, as humans, occasionally we ease very easily into autopilot. And it's not that we're bad people. We just kind of let life live us. And when we allow our minds to take control, our minds are really good at preserving the status quo. They love to embrace mediocrity. What's the science behind that? Because I've seen that happen in practice. I don't know what the science is. And how do we break free of that unconscious limitation?
So there's actually a lot of angles at which you could approach the science behind this. One thing is just we like the devil that we know. For my book, I did research into things like adult children of alcoholics. So you look at something like alcoholism, which is the cause of so much pain and suffering, everything from spousal abuse to child abuse to domestic violence to automobile accidents. I mean, there's so much bad that comes out of substance abuse. And yet a slight majority of adult children of alcoholics marry alcoholics themselves. And you would think that if anyone were to run far away from someone with a drinking problem, it would be someone who had a front row seat to the evils that a bad drinking problem can bring to your life. And yet we know that people prefer the devil that they know because we have developed coping mechanisms and life scripts and lifestyles that correspond with even really bad stuff. And people dislike uncertainty, even if it's a positive, if it's a positive uncertainty. So there's this great study that looked at people who are scared of needles, like scared of shots. And they're divided into two groups, or they can choose one of two options, I guess. And so in option A, you get a big old shot, right? Like a big old hypodermic needle, biggest ever. And then in option B, you can spin the wheel of fortune and you'll either get a little shot, a medium shot, or the same giant shot. Now you'd think if you're scared of long needles, the rational thing to do is to spin the wheel of fortune. And you have a 2/3 chance of not getting the biggest needle. But yet overwhelmingly people just get it over with and say, give me the big needle. Like,
Wow.
I'd rather have bad news than uncertain news. And so that preference for certainty, even negative certainty, is one of the things that keeps us, sort of locked into the status quo. The other thing is just you have to think about how your brain works. Your brain is small, it's like 2 to 3% of your body weight, but it accounts for nearly a quarter of your caloric expenditure in a day, of your metabolic spend. And so it's really expensive to be creative and contrarian and path breaking and to do different things. And it's really metabolically inexpensive to just get up, punch the clock, do what the people around you are doing, parrot the same stupid talking points you see on the news at night, and kind of sleepwalk through life, punctuated by your Hungry Man TV dinner and your favorite programs, right? I mean, it's just really easy to do. You're just kind of set up for that. And we really have to sort of rage against our wiring if we're to do that. And we have to open ourselves up to new experiences and take the path less chosen. And it's not easy to do. We're not wired for it. It takes volition and effort.
Yeah, I think most people refer to brains kind of in the lines of supercomputers. And I think in one of your works, you talked about that the human brain has much more in common with beer goggles than it does with a supercomputer.
Yeah.
And how do we, and I totally understand how the brain can sometimes create that warped sense of reality. And then we follow that warped sense of reality as if it was the actual reality, and we make decisions based on it. And even when we know that, it's kind of hard to counteract it. How do we fight that?
So, I think there's at least 3 things that we need to do. And the first thing, I think you just outlined there nicely, we need to understand that these are beer goggles, right? Like, we need to understand that what comes easy to us is not necessarily what is good for us. So we need education, right? Is this first piece we need. We need to understand how our brains work, how we're wired, our own personalities, such that we can perceive the world as it truly is and not just as it most sort of easily is to our minds. The second thing is we need to put ourselves in the right environments. This is like something I pound the table on so hard. It's most people are about as bad or as good as their surroundings. And that's like really, really hard for us to get our minds around. But, all of us are steps away from doing really horribly stupid stuff, evil stuff, stupid stuff, ill-advised stuff, if we put ourselves in the wrong environment. And then on the flip side, none of us are that far from greatness if we put ourselves in the right situations and surround ourselves with the right people. And so we're like water, or, we take on the shape of the vessel we're near, right? We take on the shape of the environment we've placed ourselves in. So I think that environment's really important. And then, the last piece, I call this my 3 E's, and it works for life, and it also works for financial markets, but it's education, environment, and encouragement, right? The last piece is we need people in our lives who will call us on our nonsense. Like, we need people in our lives who will say, "Hey, Daniel, do better. Like, you're not being all you could be right now." And so we need to educate ourselves. We need to put ourselves in the right places and around the right people. And then we need to surround ourselves with people and even ideas who will kind of push us back into line.
And so our environment is, our environment and the encouragement around us. I mean, you can look at that and say bad environment and discouragement is something that's really hard to overcome, right? No matter what what talents you have. You said something else in one of your writings, or actually, I think all of them. You've kind of hinted at this, that as humans, we're just wired to act. I mean, we really want to take action, and markets specifically, and there's other situations as well. Sometimes reward inaction over action, and so doing nothing can be good. It's also really hard for most of us to do nothing, especially if we're paying attention. And so, how do we maintain that, that diligence where we feel like we're really staying on top of things, but at the same time, we don't let that diligence, carry us in and create these unnecessary course corrections that we create for ourselves?
Yeah. So the tricky thing about capital markets is the rules of capital markets are diametrically opposed to the rules of everyday life in many respects. So, if you want to get smarter, you read more books. Like if you want to get stronger, you lift more weight. If you want to get faster, you run more miles. And then we know unequivocally from the research, if you want to get richer, you do nothing, right? We know, and it's easy to see how this flies in the face of our intuition. So let's go back to that 3-part framework again, because I think it takes all 3 of these E's to adhere to something that feels so unnatural. So first of all, we got to educate ourselves that what I'm talking about is the case, right? This has been studied in 19 different countries. And we know that in 19 different countries, the more someone checks their account, the worse they do. And even more dramatically, the more they transact, the worse they do. So the more they sort of trade and get in and out of the market. And it's monotonic, right? So it's a fancy way of saying it's stepwise. So the people who trade the most do worse than the people who trade the middle, and the people who trade the least do the best of all. So every, sort of across every decile, the more you trade, you do worse than the decile before you. And so we have to educate ourselves about the fact that this is counter to our wiring and that it's true. The next thing we need to do is to create the right environment. So this is kind of a dumb hack, but I'll share it anyway. I give the password to my brokerage account to my wife, and then I have her change it so I can't look at it, because I know that if I look at it, I'll want to mess with it. And so I have to create an environment where I just literally can't allow myself to get sideways. Like if I get a paper statement, I rip it up, and then I take pains to try not to give myself access to my electronic accounts, because I know that, like, if it were up to me, I'd check my account 10 times a day, and that tendency would lead me to some bad places. And so I try and create an environment that's conducive to that. And then finally, on the encouragement front, I have an advisor, right? Like I pay my dad, right? I pay my dad to manage my money and to tell me all the things that I ought to be doing, because I know that just because I've written 3 books about behavioral finance does not mean that I am that great. It does not mean that I'm special or less emotional or more rational than the next person. And so I try and intervene at every one of those levels. I educate myself about the reality of it. I try and create an environment that's conducive to acting in concert with my values. And then I get a coach in my corner to smack me when I want to do something wrong.
Yes, you're creating those multiple fail safes
Mm-hmm.
to almost protect you from yourself, even though you're as equipped as almost anybody could be to battle those demons head on. You realize that, well, those demons aren't necessarily easily battled. Right?
See, that's the point, though. There's this concept of the knowing doing gap. Like, my favorite stat with this is that doctors and nurses smoke at a higher rate than the American public. So you think about this, right? Doctors and nurses who go to whatever 12 years of school to tell us not to smoke themselves at a rate higher than the general population. And it just goes to show you that, knowing what to do and doing the right thing are very different animals, right? For some, like a third of people cheat on their spouse, and none of them are like, oh yeah, like this is good. Like this, this is what I should be doing. It's tough, it's tough.
And you actually wrote a children's book. I didn't know about this until I scheduled our podcast and started doing a little bit of legwork. And I got a hold of this. Everyone You Love Will Die.
Yeah.
And it is super cool. I mean, it's a little dark, but it really is cool. What was your aspiration for that book? I think I know, but I mean, can you?
So this is the funniest story, and I actually appreciate you bringing it up. It's my proudest. It's literally my proudest work. It's the book that I've written that I'm most proud of, and I think is probably the most enduring, even though it's the shortest by by quite a bit. So I have young children. They're getting older now, obviously, but I have young children, and I had very young children at the time this was written. And my kids, like kids do, approach me with heavy questions. And so one of the ways that I would try and respond to them in a way that's connected with them, and in a way that was a little bit more memorable than a typical dad lecture, was I would write these poems, these kind of Shel Silverstein-esque poems about hard stuff, right? And so, I've written them when my kids had questions about gay marriage, and I've written them when my kids had questions about bullying and, being different and all these things. And I wrote one about death, and basically the gist of the book is, yes, everyone you love will die, but you're here today and so am I. And it's like just trying to make the most of the moments we have. And, a great philosopher was asked once what we could do to live richer lives. And he said, spend more time in graveyards. And I really am a believer in the Stoic and the existential idea that an awareness of our own finitude and an awareness of the brevity of life is key to making life rich and making life worthwhile. So yeah, Everyone You Love Will Die, I wrote as this children's poem to my kids. I posted it on Facebook back when I was on Facebook, and my friend Naomi is like, I love this. So I did some pictures. I like effectively she illustrated it. And she goes, I illustrated this so I could use it with my own kids. And I said, well, now we've got words and we've got pictures. Like we have a book. So
we're a publisher away from a book here.
Yeah. So we put it on Kickstarter, and Kickstarter made it their like editor, whatever, pick of the day or whatever. And so we got funded in like a day. But, I mean, look, nothing grand, like got funded enough to print a couple hundred copies and give them to our friends. But it was,
you had me at funded in a day. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's better than 99.9% of all of us. So that's cool.
Yeah. So it was a neat little project that I'm glad people are still discovering.
And so that was when your kids were fairly young. And I love the family photos you post online. I mean, they're just the cutest little, most adorable family you can think of. But knowing that your kids, as they get older, they're predisposed to all the same biases that we tackle, right? So as an expert in the field, how do you prepare them? I mean, when do you start, and how do you compare the lessons you've learned to them? I mean, obviously you've done some of that work already with the early children's book, but as they get older, what do you think? How does that shake out?
So we try, I'll just sound pretentious. Like we treat dinner like we try and treat the dinner table like a salon, like a forum, right? We try and have good conversations with our kids at the dinner table, which is about the only time we're, all together consistently, and just kind of naturally help them to clarify their own thinking, to question their own assumptions, to try and be specific about where they got certain ideas from, to try and get them to challenge us and push back on us as appropriate. And so shrinks kids are famously like famously poorly behaved. So we'll see how my kids turn out. So far, they're lovely, but we really are trying to educate them. And really, there's some really good children's programming. I'm gonna space the name of some of it, but like Brain Games is very good. Like there's different programming around around the mind and how it works that's very easy for kids to grasp. And then I think travel, it's been hard for the last couple of years, but travel, I think, is another sort of natural way to drop your kids in a new culture, to have them ask good questions about the world around them, to have them critically examine the culture in which they grew up, and just ask smart questions about why things, work the way they work. And so I think travel is one of the best things you can do to reduce bias and promote openness to experience in kids.
Yeah. And so, there's a lot of, topics and a lot of conversation around the concept of financial literacy. Where's the right home for behavioral finance in that context? Where does it fit and where should it start? I mean, it's clearly important.
Yeah. So two things I'll say about financial literacy. So, Richard Thaler has said, and I wholeheartedly agree, that he hopes that years from now, behavioral finance as a discipline won't even exist, because it will be stupefying to think of the concept of finance or economics as being divorced from human behavior. Like, I think on a long enough timeline, like the fact that we tease apart, behavioral finance from the rest of finance as if it's not all behavioral, it's sort of a false distinction.
It's like how we separate dental insurance from medical insurance. It's like,
right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a holism, right? Dude, I had a toothache last year, and I can tell you it's a mess your whole world up. So, yeah, it's part of it. So I hope that it will become so deeply ingrained in the idea of what it is to think about personal finance that it just becomes a very natural extension of what's already out there. In terms of the financial literacy debate, I'll keep harping on this 3 E's. That educational layer is the base layer, and it's super important, right? I mean, it's foundational, but it's also necessary but not sufficient. And we also know that there's very poor retention. We know from the work of Ebbinghaus that we forget about 90% of what we learn in the first 3 days. And so while stuff like incorporating financial literacy classes into high school is a good start, it's certainly not a panacea. And, I took 4 years of French, and I went to Paris. I went to Paris right before COVID hit, and it was ugly. It was not super helpful. So, it's a start. But I think the other thing we have to do is we have to bake in just-in-time education. And I think the best technology providers are doing this. You'll see where you go to sell a stock, and they go, okay, are you sure you want to do this? Because here's the tax implications of that. And you go, oh, yeah. That's a more effective intervention than giving high school or college kids, a 3-hour lecture on tax policy. Is there at the moment at the moment of action, you're educating them. So I think, yes, we do need financial literacy. It, of course, needs to be behaviorally informed. But even more urgently, we need systems, processes, and technology that have inducements for good behavior baked in. Because a lot of the technology we have currently has inducements for bad
Inducements for the opposite.
Yeah.
And so the promise of embedded finance is, financial literacy at the point of decision.
Yeah, 100%.
And so that's a great point. So as advisors, are we really qualified to serve as behavioral coaches, or is it just more realistic that we create that environment and then we also create processes, kind of like what you've done internally, just to limit the ability of our lizard brain to take over?
Well, I would say first of all, don't underestimate the the power of stuff like, initiating those processes. Like if that's your idea and the client wouldn't have done it otherwise, then like you you don't have to have some flowery conversation to get in the way of a bad behavior. Like, you've done your job. Like, if the process does its job. But the other thing I would say is that the research points to the relationship as being the fundamental determinant of whether or not a client takes a piece of advice. So every piece of rapport building and trust building and connection that an advisor does in the good times, right? Like in peacetime, is building up an emotional reserve that is then drawn upon in wartime, when markets are volatile and when folks want to do the wrong thing. So being a behavioral coach is not like you knowing all the right words to say or having 8 years of college to be a deep listener or something like that. I think a lot of times it's very unsexy and it looks like you just being a good person, you being straight up, you adding value to a client's life, and creating a level of trust. That means you can keep them from being their own worst enemy at the point of decision.
And let's assume that we're kind of all aware of these behavioral limitations, just on an individual level, not necessarily from an advisor level. I've always thought awareness is certainly step one in almost anything. But assuming that, what's the goal? Are our behavioral maladies, are they something that can be cured, or do we just put in place something to manage the symptoms?
So I think there's a couple of things we can do, right? And so in some cases, it's going to be sort of an awareness of negative bias that causes you to do some of the things that I did, to like throw some roadblocks in your own way to keep you from your worst impulses. But I think it's a mistake to think about behavioral finance as exclusively the study of how screwed up we are. I mean, that's kind of how it started. And that actually mirrors the progression of psychology. Like, if you look at psychology as a broad discipline, psychology started with the study of, why you hate your mom and, like why
just all kinds of malcontents.
Yeah. It's like, it started as the study of anxiety, depression, discontent, suicide, like all these sort of deviations from positive behavior. But in the last 30 or 40 years, we have this whole field of positive psychology, which is the study of what makes people great. What makes people happy, what makes people thrive, what makes people great leaders. And so I think behavioral finance is undergoing a similar shift. Like, it started off as the cataloging of the hundreds of ways in which you can make dumb decisions. And that was a necessary break from traditional economics. So like, I get why that had to happen. But now we're also seeing the study of, what makes people happy, what makes people thrive, what makes people feel like they have enough money, what makes people more generous. And that's all part of it too. And the other thing that I would say, there's some real instances, anytime you can roll with a behavioral tendency instead of try to push against it, you're going to have a lot more success. So you think about the Save More Tomorrow program, which all it is the automation of withdrawing retirement savings and the automation of escalating those savings over time. That's the whole thing. We're going to automatically withdraw this from your account, and as you get raises, we're going to take more and more. So you don't sort of spend up to your new means. And that has saved American investors tens of billions of dollars by playing on our tendency to be kind of lazy and forgetful and status quo prone. So you think about, like, we talked earlier, we're like, oh, humans are kind of lazy and status quo prone and forgetful. Like, yeah, that's true. But if we can lock that in a way that makes us richer, like, let's do it. So you have to guard against your worst impulses, but we should also be looking for ways where behavioral science can teach us, what makes us happy, what makes us better, and also be thinking about, ways we can sort of roll with the punches, so to speak.
Yeah, and speaking of roll with the punches, I'm a suffering Rangers fan, and I know you're a huge baseball fan, so I thought we would get this out of the way since I know you're a huge Cardinals fan. We have to talk about game 6, October 2011.
David Freese here? Is this what we're talking about?
Yes, Busch Stadium against my beloved and hapless Rangers. What's your most vivid memory?
So I was at my buddy's house during game 6. I was at my buddy's house, and he had young children. And so we were watching the game, and his wife was getting, I think, annoyed because he had a baby. And I was kind of like, he needs to go help. I'm in the way. I got to get out of here. So I say my goodbyes. I get in the car. I'm driving home, and I'm listening to the game on the radio. And Freese gets his hit, and I have never screamed so loud in my life, yelling and screaming at the top of my lungs like a maniac on I-15 in Salt Lake City, Utah. I was out on vacation. So that is my memory of Game 6.
Well, as all Rangers fans, we knew Chris Carpenter was pitching in Game 7. So we knew, for us, Game 6 was Game 7. If we didn't win that one, we were in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, Chris Carpenter was not going to lose Game 7 of the World Series.
And when Josh Hamilton hit that home run in the 10th inning, I finally believed. I thought, oh, my God, I cannot believe it. The Rangers are actually going to win the World Series. And then, of course, we managed to give it back in the 10th inning. And then as soon as Freese hit that home run, it was everybody in my neighborhood watched Game 7, obviously, but none of us expected to win. We thought that was our chance.
David Freese will never have to buy a beer in St. Louis. That's for sure.
Yeah, and he probably should be really careful when he's driving in the Arlington area. So, and I also understand that you're an aspiring baker. Is that true?
So it's funny. I didn't know you were going to ask me this. I am working on a lovely rosemary focaccia as we speak.
All right.
Yeah, look, this is a very basic hobby. Like the rest of America, I developed a baking obsession during COVID. And so, yeah, I've always, I enjoy cooking generally and baking in specific. And so, I bake Filipino food, especially with my oldest daughter. I bake cookies with my youngest daughter, and love to cook. And my wife and I fight about who gets to cook because we both enjoy it so much.
Oh, really? So what's your favorite thing about it? What do you is it relaxing to you? Is there a little bit of a challenge to it, or what is it?
It's meditative to me. Like it's meditative. It's not work, and it's not laziness. I feel like a lot of what I do is work, and then at night kind of like crash and watch Netflix or whatever. So things like things like baking, things like playing the guitar, things like going on walks in nature, to me are not quite Netflix, but not quite work. And they're kind of a lovely uh, space in
Oh, I got it.
between.
And then, so are you the kind of guy who follows the recipe, or are you
So
incapable of following it? Do you have to add your own twist to it?
no. So with baking for sure, yes. For with baking, I definitely follow the recipe. With cooking, no. And I treat it a bit like Chopped. I'm at my best when the groceries are kind of low. You know,
Oh, really? Okay.
like I'm kind of at my best when it's getting a little random in the pantry, and you're like, we got some, some mushrooms and some cranberries and some spaghetti. Like, what are we gonna do? So, yeah, it's that's I pride myself on being clutch in that respect. When things are kind of dicey, I can kind of make a miracle.
Oh, that's cool. Well, let's talk about recipes. Let's talk about the recipe between automation and customization.
All right.
Because I think in our world, most plans are missing the right combination of both of these. I see a lot of people that have a huge amount of automation and no customization in their plans, and the reverse. What do you think's the right recipe for that?
Well, so I think I think what's important is I think customization is important, but I think what's equally important is felt customization on the part of the client. So I think the client, I'm not taking away the actual benefits to a customized plan, but I think it's equally important to convey to a client that their plan has been customized. And that's why I'm really high on things like direct indexing. There will people who will say, well, direct indexing is just like, whatever. This is just like SMAs for the masses. And while that might be true at a functional perspective, at a psychological perspective, someone knowing and understanding that an allocation was created specifically for them and their preferences and their needs is a powerful thing. So I think it's important to customize, but I think it's equally important to communicate that level of customization. I this is sort of a silly analogy, but we spent a summer in Pennsylvania, and we took the kids to the Hershey like chocolate factory thing, and
Uh-huh.
they have this thing where you can design your own candy bar. And I mean, look, it's you got like three options. It's like dark milk, white, and then you put a little couple things in. There's not a ton of permutations. My kids would all tell you it's the greatest thing they've ever eaten, because they got to pick out the white chocolate. They got to pick out the sprinkles, whatever. It's like 100 candy bars they've had before and since, but the element of customization made their experience different, and I think it's just as true in our business.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that customization promotes value and ownership,
Yes,
and automation promotes reliability.
sure.
And so if you can marry the two, I've always thought that was a benefit for everyone. Not that it just seems like there's a lot of people that are either in the automation camp or the customization camp, and I don't fall into that because I think there's benefits to both.
Well,
Um,
to your point, I don't even see them as mutually exclusive. Like, I think, there's a ton of behavioral benefit to be had from automation, right? And just following simple rules, but those rules can conform to an individual client's needs and preferences. And so I think you could marry them up quite easily. Did we just create a business, James? Did we just start a business?
oh, gosh, I hope not. I don't have any extra time in my day now,
Yeah,
so
that's a good point.
if we did, Dr. Dan, it's all yours, baby. You
I'll
can
stick
have
with the
it.
bread, man. I'll stick with the bread.
Just send me a very, very small royalty, and I'll be fine with it. So, and I understand Orion's working on a tool to help couples have more productive conversations about money.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. So it's based on some research I did into, effectively what do couples fight about when they fight about money. So, Carl Jung has this great quote that I'll butcher here, but it's, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. I actually think I got it.
I
But,
think you nailed it.
the idea is that until we illuminate salient differences between two people, my wife's going to go, Daniel's like this. And I'm going to say, she's like this. And we're going to see that as a flaw in the other person. But what we did is we did research, and there were these different dimensions that emerged, and they're not good or bad. So I'll give you the one that elicited the most fierce fighting, and it was, is money best used to secure, to enjoy today, or to secure tomorrow? They're both important, right? They're both important, but people tend to have a strong preference for one over the other. And if your spouse is out of preference, right? Like if my preference is to enjoy today and my wife's preference is to secure tomorrow, we look at each other judgmentally. She says I'm irresponsible, I say she's no fun. And so what we've tried to do here is illuminate these differences, give people a non-pejorative way to think about and talk about each other, and to understand each other better, and to work for harmony, and to sort of strive for that middle ground. Because I think advisors, insofar as, depending on who you ask, conflict about money is the number one cause of divorce in North America. So, or sometimes it's number two, but it's a big deal, right? And I think it's a place where advisors can add value outside of the traditional scope of work.
And how much do you think is the prevalence of dual careers, the access to information and different types of information, blended families, all those things? I mean, how much do those add to the struggle of couples communications? Is it just kind of an ancillary effect, or is the way couples have to communicate today just different than the way it was maybe 20 years ago?
Well, there's certainly, there's certainly complicating. There's certainly a million complicating factors, but I'll say that the biggest thing is we tend to uncritically adopt the money scripts of the people by whom we were raised, right? Like, the house I grow up in forms my basis of how I think about money, and the house that my partner grows up in forms how she thinks about money. Then we get together and it's kind of worlds colliding, and we've never questioned. It's an N of one meeting an N of one. Like we've both had a singular experience. We're bringing those together. These fish don't know they're wet. And then I go, oh, she thinks about this differently than me. That's dumb. Like, that's wrong. And we haven't always had the language to think about, to articulate, or to question our own experiences with money. And so that's why I think this is a valuable framework for that. Because I think, all that other stuff aside, I think we form opinions about money that are largely unexamined and that are strongly tied to things like love of family. And that's a recipe for conflict in some ways.
Yeah. And do you think that those conversations evolve over time? I mean, is there I know for instance, when my wife and I got back from our honeymoon, we went to the bank to see how much money we had left. And it was like, I think it was like $26. I mean, so, we could have had very different visions, monetary visions, but we didn't have enough money to really, spend a lot of time on. We could have just gone to dinner and we'd been down to zero. So yeah, it wasn't like top of mind. It wasn't a powerful conversation to have and feel like what our differences are. But, as you get older, as you have kids, as you accumulate assets, as you get two different careers, two different retirements, one person has stock options, one person doesn't. It would seem to me that conversation has to fundamentally change and be reevaluated over time. And we talk all the time in our business about reevaluating someone's risk tolerance and updating their net worth, but we never really talk about, or at least I don't see where we're talking about updating the conversations they have based on where they are in their lives and what's going on now.
So it's a great point, and I have a nearly identical story. I took my wife out for a nice dinner, and when we got engaged, and I proposed at this, like, outside of this sort of 5-star resort dinner place, and I got back and I had $12 left. $12 left. It would not have cleared if she.
Yeah, no, we call that victory.
Yeah, thank God she didn't order dessert, because I would have, like, it could have gone the other way. But if you had asked me early in our marriage, right? I have a specific memory. We lived in Hawaii right after we got married, which was a tough gig, but like we lived in Hawaii right after we got married. My wife's hair dryer broke, and we could not afford to replace it. I mean, we didn't have the whatever $50 or whatever a hair dryer cost to replace it, and so it was like, hey, you gotta dry your hair in the Hawaiian sun for a couple of weeks until we can, get back there. And, that was very top of mind. Like, our conversations were around those sorts of things. Now we're in a different place. Our money scripts have changed. Our realities have changed. And now it's about stuff like kids and supporting aging family members and things like that. So this thing we're rolling out called the Money 20 is brand new. But I think we will absolutely have to use it iteratively, and we'll definitely have to check back in with people as they, move through the lifespan.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to seeing this summer release. Is that what you're targeting?
Oh my gosh, I don't even. I'll get killed by the devs if I promise anything. I don't know.
I'll probably go back and edit that out, but I'll just let the record let the record show you didn't promise a delivery date. So.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Crosby, I thank you so much. I'm going to leave you with one more question. One of the things I love about your work is, and I've tried to read as much, on this topic as I can, but I love the practical nature of your advice. I mean, within almost everything that you write, you commit to these, the top 10 list in, in the laws of wealth, and you have the top 3 things you've got to do. I mean, they're actionable, practical items that somebody can take away. So I felt like it wouldn't be fair to the listeners if I didn't ask you to give us 2 takeaways that, people can take away from this podcast if they happen to listen to it, and maybe work that into their mindset to become just better investors, better financial stewards.
Yeah. So, I'll say 2 things. The first thing is, an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and an object at rest tends to stay at rest. So James Clear has written this zillion-selling book, Atomic Habits, that's all about changing behavior. And one of his favorite takeaways, one of my favorites of takeaways of his from the book, is this thing called the 2-minute rule, right? So if you want to run a marathon, well, you're currently watching Netflix, right? So you got to get up and be active for 2 minutes, right? And then you go do the next 2 minutes. The next day you do the next 2 minutes, and it gets a little harder till soon you're walking 10 miles. Then you're running 5 miles. Then you're running 10 miles. Then you run a half marathon. One of the things that we do that is so destructive to behavior change is to try to swing for the fences. So if people are looking to make a change to the way that they operate with money, pick the most infinitesimally small change you can think of, make that change. When you do it, pat yourself on the back, reward yourself, and make another change that's 10% harder than that. Don't shoot for the $1 million, the $1 million business right out of the gate. Don't shoot for the marathon right out of the gate. Get the flywheel turning, get the behavior change rolling, and that's going to help a lot. The second thing I would say, this one covers so many ills in terms of financial behavior, is work with a professional. The research is unequivocal that people who work with a financial advisor, not only do they tend to do dramatically better in terms of their performance for behavioral reasons, They're also more ready for an emergency. They're happier. They have higher life satisfaction. They even have better communication between partners, between romantic partners. Money is the number one stressor for American families and has been for every year since the American Psychological Association has started measuring this. If you can get someone in your corner to help you with your money, all this other stuff falls in place. So, get your own behavior, financial or otherwise, moving in a good direction incrementally, and then get someone on your team who you can trust. Because when you get your money right, a lot of other stuff gets right too.
Wow. Well, it was awesome to have you on, and thank you so much for spending some time with us. Good luck on all the stuff that you're doing at Orion, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
And that's a wrap for our latest episode of A Voice from the Hills podcast with our special guest, Daniel Crosby. Thanks again to Dr. Crosby for joining us. We covered a smorgasbord of behavioral finance with a side helping of baking and baseball. So it was really cool. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out any of Dr. Crosby's works, all of his published works are available online. You can easily find them through a Google search on the internet. Dr. Crosby is also very active and responsive on various social media platforms. So if you'd like to follow him, please do so. If you'd like to follow our program and A Voice from the Hills, you can listen on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much anywhere you currently listen to podcasts or engage in that type of content. Or you can also listen, you can access the episodes and past episodes that we have on our website at Silicon Hills Wealth. Again, thank you for Dr. Crosby for joining us. Hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did. And, thank you for listening, because, we can only do our best work if you are here to listen.